Thank you everyone for joining our webinar on Australian mandatory climate reporting, specifically focused on an introduction to qualitative climate scenario analysis today. The perceptive amongst you will probably realise that I am not Ash Turner, so sorry about that. Something has come up and she's not been able to join today. So you're stuck with me for the next half an hour. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James. I lead SLR's climate change and net zero strategy team across APAC, so covering Australia, New Zealand and Southeast Asia. In terms of what we're going to be covering on the webinar today, so I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to SLR and to the climate change team. I think most of you will be familiar with us by now, so I won't spend too long on that. And then I'll dive into the requirements under ASRS for climate scenario analysis. So understanding what you need to do, when you need to do it by, and then for the main focus of the webinar, we'll be going through the approach that you'll need to undertake. So some key considerations, how you should work through that scenario analysis and what it will feed into. I'll spend a little bit of time summing up at the end, and then there should be time for a bit of Q&A. So there is a Q&A function within Teams. So if you have any questions as we go, please drop them into the chat. We'll try and get to as many of those as we can at the end of the session today. If we don't get to your question, we can always follow up with you afterwards as well. Only other thing to note before we get started, the webinar is being recorded, so if you miss half of it or you want to send this on to one of your colleagues, we'll send around the webinar to everyone who signed up, and also this will go up on our website for you to go and watch later as well. So a very brief overview of SLR, who for those of you who don't know, so SLR is a global environmental and sustainability consultancy. We cover lots of different things, as you can see on the screen, from technical on-the-ground environmental services all the way through to the strategic side of advisory work that our corporate sustainability team does. The climate change team, which I lead, sits within that broader corporate sustainability group, but focusing very much on climate change, both in terms of the impact the companies are having on climate through their own greenhouse gas emissions, as well as understanding emerging climate risks and how we can adapt your business to deal with those. For those of you who joined the last webinar, you'll be aware that this is the second in a series. So that the first webinar that we ran earlier in the year was really just an introduction to the new mandatory reporting standards. Throughout the year, we're planning to run a series of further webinars on some of the key elements of those disclosures, starting with climate scenario analysis today, but there'll be more to come over the next few months. So please keep an eye out as we publish those. The other thing I wanted to say is if anyone has any ideas, anything that you're kind of really struggling with or really want more guidance or information on within the disclosures, please do let us know. We can think about maybe adding an additional webinar for that. So let's get into it. Firstly, I just wanted to run through what ASRS requires around climate scenario analysis. So this is probably the biggest piece of work that companies are having to do and the bit that we're getting the most questions around, which is why we thought we'd start our webinar series with this one. In terms of where it sits, so those of you who are on the previous webinar we did will probably be familiar with this diagram. There's a few key things that you need to do in order to prepare for ASRS. So down the bottom, it's all about understanding the impact that your business is having on climate. So what are your scope 1 and 2, your operational emissions, your value chain emissions in scope 3, and what metrics and targets are you setting around managing those? That part is the piece that most people have the best handle on, or there are some things, especially in scope 3, that people are struggling with. The other piece is all about understanding the impact that climate change is going to have on your business. And this is where the climate scenario analysis piece really comes in. There's effectively 3 steps to understanding that. The first is identifying all of the risks and opportunities that you could be exposed to. The second step, which is the focus of today, is analyzing those risks. So you understand what risks you have, you then need to understand in potential climate futures, how are those risks going to impact your business? And then the final piece of the puzzle is then understanding what are you going to do about it. So how are you going to build or understand the resilience that you have to those risks? all of those things then feed into your transition plan. So the final piece of the puzzle is then how do you bring all of that together to understand your decarbonisation targets, your roadmaps, and then the mitigation and adaptations that you need to add on in light of the climate risks. In terms of some of the specifics around climate scenario analysis, so climate scenario analysis sits within the strategy pillar of the ASRS disclosures. One thing to note from the table that we have up there is actually the scenario analysis piece, as well as the resilience assessment that I just mentioned, doesn't need to be assured in your first year of disclosure. So there's quite a lot of flexibility here in terms of how far you need to go and what you'll need to disclose in year one, but you will be expected to disclose something around this analysis. So generally our recommendation is, as this has to be assured in year two anyway, and you need to disclose something, you're probably going to want to do the vast majority of this work in preparation for your first year of reporting. In terms of how ASRS is asking you to approach climate scenario analysis, there are some criteria that are kind of mandatory, but some flexibility in there around exactly how you do approach this. So the first piece is that you need at least 2 scenarios that you have to assess, and they do have some guidance around what those scenarios need to be as well. So firstly, you need a low warming scenario, so one that is below 2 degrees, consistent with the Paris Agreement and also consistent with the Australian government targets for net zero. And then the second thing you need to do is look at a high warming scenario, so exceeding 2.5 degrees, potentially even higher. And the reason why they've defined these boundaries is to make sure that companies are looking at a range of possible futures, both the low warming scenario where you're seeing more transitional risks and those high warming scenarios where the physical risks of climate change are more apparent. You also need to think about the time horizons that you're looking at. So you have to clearly define at least three time horizons that you'll consider these risks under. So short, medium, and long term. They're not prescriptive in terms of what short, medium, and long term actually mean. So these do need to be relevant to your business and to your operating context. We tend to see that most companies will want to use slightly different definitions for climate risks, what short, medium, and long term means, than you may be using for your typical risk management processes. So short might be in your business planning, 1 or less than 1 year, but actually under a climate change scenario, you don't see much change under such a short time frame. So you may be looking out to 5-10 years, even under that short time frame. The other thing that is worth bearing in mind is the scope that scenario analysis needs to cover. So both the physical risks, which are the ones that most people think about when you think about climate change, but also thinking about the transitional risks that you'll see under those climate scenarios as well as thinking about the full value chain of your business as well. So it's very easy to focus in on your direct operations and how you're being impacted, but you also need to bear in mind both upstream impacts from your suppliers and logistics, as well as downstream impacts to the customers that you're serving and the markets that you're operating in. The final question that we get a lot is, do you need to quantify these risks? So the quantification piece is quite interesting. If you read the standard, the first answer that you'll get to this question is, yes, you need to quantify everything, and you need financial impact figures. But if you keep reading, there are lots of caveats in there. So you do have flexibility around that quantification piece if it is too difficult, or you can't unpick the different risks that you've identified, or even if you just don't have the capacity or the capabilities internally in order to do that quantification, you are allowed to publish qualitative information instead. What we tend to recommend for most of our clients is, if you are new to this, start with a qualitative assessment. It's a lot in and of itself. So working through a qualitative assessment to understand the ranking and the prioritization of those risks in the first instance, and then you can start to think about quantification in latter years. So that was a bit about what you need to do for ASRS. I'm going to take a bit of a step back now and talk about what climate scenario analysis actually is and what it is useful for. So one of the issues that companies run into when they're thinking about their exposure to climate change risks is the massive amount of uncertainty we have around what the future is going to hold. What we do know is, if nothing changes, we continue along the business as usual pathway, global greenhouse gas emissions stay as they are or continue to rise, we're going to see increasing impacts from the physical changes that are occurring due to climate change. So more extreme droughts, more fires, more flooding, heavier precipitation, higher temperatures, all of those things that people think about and starting to see more and more of in the news will only continue to get worse if we don't do anything about it. If we do want to reduce those global greenhouse gas emissions, we need to drastically change the way that everything is operating. So shifting power generation away from fossil fuels towards renewables, thinking about electrification of processes, of heat, of transport, changes to the technologies that we're using. And in order to support all of those changes that are needed, massive changes to the regulatory and legal systems that we're operating in. That might be carbon taxes being implemented, that might be mandates on technologies that you're allowed to use, a whole host of different things that will need to change in order to reduce those emissions. Those two things are inherently in tension. So the faster we move on decarbonising the global economy, the less physical impacts from climate change we are going to see. The slower those things will change, the more physical impacts we're going to see. The problem is we don't know where on that spectrum we're going to land. And there's such a huge range of possibilities that for companies coming blind into this, you just don't know what you need to assess. You don't know what's going to happen. And it becomes impossible to actually come up with a coherent plan around how you're going to manage those risks. What climate scenario analysis does is, rather than try to predict the future, what it says is you just need to take a few different scenarios, so high warming, a low warming, and maybe a middle of the road scenario that you say, what if this happens? How is that going to impact us? So looking at a high warming scenario, saying, if this were to occur, how bad would the physical impacts be, and what would the knock-on effect to our business be? If we end up in one of those lower warming scenarios, all of those transitions are happening, how is that going to impact our business? And rather than trying to say this is going to happen, you say, what if this did happen? This is what the impact would be. This is what our response will be. And then you can use that to start thinking about your strategic decision making and planning as those things start to occur. In terms of the range of things that you need to consider, so as I mentioned earlier, there are both physical and transitional risks that need to be considered. The physical risks are all of the ones that people tend to think about. So all of those acute risks, floods, cyclones, fires, things like that, as well as more chronic changes to those risks as well. So temperature changes to precipitation patterns, things like that. The transition risks are all of the things related to that transition to a low carbon economy that I described. So thinking about how that is going to impact your business. Some of them will be fairly direct. A direct carbon tax, for example, is going to be fairly easy to understand. Some of them will be much more indirect and difficult to work through. So changes to your customer demands around your sustainability credentials, or changes to the markets that you are serving as those technologies change. So that's a bit about what scenario analysis is and how it can be used. I'm now going to run through our recommended approach. So when you're thinking about scenario analysis, there's basically three questions that you need to ask. The first is, what risks are we going to be exposed to? So thinking about that big matrix of risks that I just talked about, which of those are going to be relevant to your business? The second thing you need to do is figure out how bad those risks are going to be. And then the final thing, which I won't talk about too much today, but is worth keeping in mind, is what are you going to do about it? So you've identified risks, you know how bad they are, you then need to think about your plan for managing and mitigating those. In terms of the steps that we have there, so the first thing you need to do is actually select the scenarios that you're going to assess. As I said, some of that is prescribed by the ASRS, but there is a bit of flexibility there, so it's worth going through a process to understand which exact scenarios you're going to look at. You then need to go through that process to identify the risks, and there are lots of different ways that you can do that. There's lots of really good public databases and sources that you can pull from, but a big part of that needs to be engagement with your business as well. So talking to operational teams or talking to management teams, understanding where you're likely to be exposed. You then need to go through the process to actually evaluate and assess those risks, and that's what I'm going to be talking about later, so I won't talk about that now, and then understand what you're going to do about it. And so I'm going to run through each of the first 3 points there with a few examples of how we've taken clients through this in the past, and a few things that you might want to consider as you work through this approach. So the first piece is selecting the scenarios that you need to look at. As I mentioned, ASRS requires at least 2 scenarios. So the first one that you definitely need to look at is a high warming scenario. So that's where you see the more extreme physical impacts from climate change. There are a few options around how extreme you can go with that. For most of our clients, we recommend going with the most extreme scenarios that are out there. So SSP 8.5, which is sometimes called a kind of hothouse world or a runaway global warming scenario. What that does is gives you effectively a worst case scenario of those physical impacts that you could see. We are currently tracking towards that future world, so I think it's a pretty good idea to take that into account. The second thing you need to look at is a low warming scenario. So the one that we've selected here is the most extreme transition scenario that you could have. So a rapid, orderly transition towards a global net zero world. Under that scenario, you see massive, rapid changes to the energy systems, to transport systems, and to the policies and the things that are being put in place at a local level in order to enable those changes. We also tend to recommend a third scenario. So you don't have to do this under ASRS, but we find that third scenario is really good for kind of completing the picture and giving you that full view of what the potential outcomes are going to be. Quite often that middle of the road scenario would be selected is called a disorderly scenario or a disjointed transition, where you have less predictability, but random rapid changes to some of that policy. So maybe a carbon tax suddenly gets applied without giving you time to plan and mitigate for that. Some of our clients actually see more extreme transition risks in that middle of the road scenario because of the fact that you do not have the time to plan and prepare for some of those emerging risks. So once you've selected those scenarios, you then need to build out the world that you're exploring. And the key thing here is finding consistent, reliable data sets that you can use in order to inform the assessment of those risks. So if we think about the orderly transition that we're going to be looking at, some really important things that we need to understand there is how bad is the carbon tax going to be? So how extreme and how quickly will that be applied? You'll want to understand the shifts in the technologies that are being used and how that's going to have a knock-on effect to your business. In order to get good data around that, there's a couple of things that you'll need to do. The first is find a good base scenario that you can use in order to understand the global context. The wording that we have here, orderly, disorderly, hothouse, is from NGFS, so Network for Greening the Financial System. They're one of the best sources for these overarching scenario narratives and provide really, really good quality data on a lot of the things that you will need to look at. There are other places you can get those data sets from. So I think IEA, the International Energy Agency, is a really good source as well. Once you've got that base scenario, you'll then want to think about layering that with more local specific data, as well as kind of industry specific data as well. So you'll want to look at the policy environment that you're operating in, specifically in Australia, but there may be variations between the states and also variations depending on the industries that you're operating in as well. And also thinking on the physical risk side about what level of granularity you need for that data as well. If you're heavily reliant on a single site, so you're a mine, for example, and you've got one site that's going to be really important, you're going to want really, really good quality data for that site. If you're a retailer and you've got 1,000 sites across Australia, you might not need to go and get really good data for every single one of those sites, but you're going to want at least a sampling of that data so you can understand the trends and what that's going to look like. So building out those scenarios, getting the data sets in place, understanding how you're going to actually assess those risks. The next thing you need to do is map out all of the potential risks that you could be exposed to. I won't go through this in too much detail, but I think the key thing I want to call out here is the split between physical and transitional. So yes, those physical risks that most people are aware of, thinking about chronic changes as well as those acute ones, but also all of those potential transitional risks. And the other thing that's really important is thinking about the spread across your value chain. Those operational risks at your sites and at your own operations are fairly easy to understand and fairly easy to look at kind of where you're going to be exposed. Once you start thinking beyond that, looking upstream at your suppliers, it gets much more complex. So a carbon tax impacting you, very easy to understand. How a carbon tax impacting your suppliers and how that might change the costs to you in terms of raw material sourcing and things like that is going to be a much blurrier line. Similar on the physical impacts as well. So looking at impacts to your suppliers, how that's going to disrupt them, potentially how that disrupts supply chains and sourcing of the critical parts or materials that you need as well. You also need to think about customers as well. So looking downstream of your business, and depending on what you're selling and what you're doing as an organization, that's going to be very, very different. But if you're a mine, for example, the minerals that you're selling, the demand for those is going to change rapidly over some of those transition scenarios. So if you're selling coal, for example, decreased demand under those transition scenarios. If you're selling transition metals, copper, lithium, rare earth metals, the demand for that is likely to increase quite rapidly. So looking at the balance between those two things. In terms of how you then actually go about assessing that, so I've got a couple of examples, one physical and one transition risk, of the types of data you might want to look at. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but I think there's a few key things that I want to call out. So firstly, for the physical risks, it's really important to understand how this is going to impact you specifically at a site level. There's some quite good data that is kind of broad brush across Australia or globally that you can get for some of the overarching trends. But actually, when you get down into the details, you can see some quite extreme changes at a local level that will be really important to understand. So this is some data for extreme precipitation for one of our clients that we have generated, looking at 24-hour extreme rain events. In the baseline, they were getting about 157 millimeters in these extreme rain events as they were occurring. But as you look out to 2050, 2070, out towards 2100, in that hothouse world, so the highest warming scenario, you're seeing kind of almost a doubling or even more in terms of the amount of rain that they're getting in those events. If you're again, I'm talking quite a lot about mining here, but if you're a miner and you're designing your mine around those 1 in 100-year events, looking at 157 millimeters of rainfall as your design criteria, and over the next 10, 20 years, that is increasing up to 240 millimeters. That's really important information. So understanding what that looks like in detail is going to be really valuable. I mentioned some alternative ways that you can look at this. So if you're not super reliant on individual sites, so you're a retailer, for example, you might want to go a bit broader brush with this and just take a sampling of your sites across the country. If you do that, it's still quite important to get some real data. So you can look at maybe a sample of your sites, get some real information, take that and use that as an engagement tool. So you can go and talk to your operations managers or your site managers to say, okay, what would happen if we had this level of rainfall or these temperatures at these sites, and then use that to project across the rest of your portfolio. So you don't necessarily need to go out and get data for everything, but you need enough to make an informed decision and informed assessment of those risks. Second one that I wanted to talk about was one of those transition risks. So the transition risks are obviously very different for those physical risks. A lot of the changes that you're seeing here are, whilst they are relevant locally, they're not going to be kind of as granular level of data that you're going to need. So a lot of the time here, you're talking more at management levels and understanding kind of the overarching impact on the business. The projections that we've got here are for potential carbon taxes under these future scenarios. I think it's really important to remember that the way that we're using this scenario analysis is not saying that these carbon taxes will be applied, but we're projecting a future scenario where this has happened. So in this orderly transition scenario, we'll get to 2050, carbon tax is at $700 a ton. What you can then do is say, okay, if that were to occur, this has happened, how is that going to impact us and how would we respond to that? So it's just giving you guidance around the levels of impacts you're likely to see and a tool that you can use then to start analyzing that. The final thing I want to mention is what do you do with all of that information? So it's all well and good going out, great information, great site level information around how those risks and opportunities are going to change. The last thing that's really important is then coming up with a way to use that information to systematically score those risks and opportunities and rank them against each other. If you're going deep dive into a quantitative approach, you can do that through what is the impact on the bottom line, on your revenue, on your operational costs. If you're going through a qualitative approach, you need a consistent scoring system. This is the one that SLR uses. It's based on the ISO climate risk definition, and there's a few things that feed into that. So first two, magnitude and likelihood. Anyone who's done any risk management processes will understand what those two things means, but how bad is the risk going to be and how likely is it to occur? And you assess that under each of the different climate scenarios and each of the different time horizons that you're looking at. That is effectively the data that we've just looked at. So that's what's going to happen. How bad is it going to be? The other thing that you need to bear in mind is this vulnerability score. So that's then thinking about, okay, if this thing happens, how bad is that actually going to be for your business? How sensitive are you to those changes? How exposed are you? And also the adaptive capacity of your business as well. So that's thinking about how easily can you pivot or change your operations in order to manage those risks. That type of information is going to come from your business. So you need to be talking to site managers, to operational managers, to for some of those transition risks for your kind of management and strategy teams to understand what the response would be and how easy those changes are going to be to make. If you do this properly, you can then do a ranking of all of your risks and opportunities, both transitional and physical, in a way that is comparable. And you can then come up with a top 10 list of the ones that you need to focus on, that you're going to report on, and then also thinking about future quantification, which of these are going to be material enough to really focus in on. So I'll wrap up very briefly and then try and take a couple of questions before the end. There's a few things that I think it's really worth bearing in mind when you start this scenario analysis approach. So the first is scenario analysis can and should be more than a compliance task. Whilst you need to do this for your mandatory reporting, if you do this properly, it becomes a tool to navigate that uncertainty, to build resilience, and to understand the future strategy for your business. The second piece that's really important is the future is going to be different. We know it's going to be different. We just don't know exactly how it's going to be different. So it's really important to get that good quality data, focus on how things are going to change, especially on the physical risk side. Planning based on historical events is no longer going to be good enough. You need to understand how things are going to change going forwards. Third point is the location and sector specificity of the information that you need. So physical risks especially, it's really important to get that location specific information, not just relying on global national data sets, but actually how is this going to change at your site. For the transition risks, those tend to be more sectoral or state or country level, but it's still really important to get that data in order to inform the assessment. The final piece, which I cannot emphasize enough, is engagement is absolutely essential. So data is part of the puzzle, understanding what's going on, but actually the real insights and the way that this translates into the resilience and the kind of actual actionable insights at the end of this is by engaging different teams within your business. So talking to a site team about the effect of those different changes to precipitation, what that would actually mean, how would they respond, what have they seen in the past. That information is absolutely crucial to be able to action anything that comes out the back of this assessment. Finally, I'll leave you with a little timeline. So one thing to note is this is not going to be a quick process. There are ways that you can accelerate this, but for most of our clients, this is kind of a 4 to 6 month assessment, from developing those scenarios, identifying the risks, taking the time to engage the business as you go through that assessment of risks and opportunities, and then that final stage around assessing resilience, which you also need to do for that first year of disclosure. For those of you in Group 1 reporter, especially if you're a calendar year reporter, that means you're going to need to get moving on this pretty quickly. For those of you in kind of Group 2 and 3, you still do have time. Our recommendation is get started on this sooner rather than later, because this will inform a lot of the other disclosures that you'll need to do, but just bearing in mind some of the constraints and timelines that you'll need to work through. And I think that's it. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. We don't have very much time for questions, but I'll see if I can take a couple before we sign off. So the first one, which is one that I'm not surprised to see, is do we need quantification of these risks as well as this qualitative assessment I've been talking about? So I talked a little bit about this earlier. As I said, scenario analysis should be ultimately quantitative. So working through that quantification piece is something you ultimately want to get to, but there are caveats in the standard that say you don't need to do this if it's difficult, if you don't have capacity, or if it's commercially sensitive and you aren't ready to disclose that. So our recommendation is start with a qualitative assessment, and then you can use that qualitative assessment to then rank which risks you want to take forward to quantification in future years. I've got another question in the chat about whether you only use scenario analysis to identify your climate risks and opportunities. This is actually a really good question, and we're seeing different ways that companies approach this. Some companies do the identification of risks first and then analyze those risks with the scenario analysis. Our recommendation is you start with building those scenarios. So you actually assess what risk you're going to be emerged with the context of the scenarios and the changes that are going to be happening. If you do it the other way around, you risk missing some of those potential changes. So actually starting with scenarios and then using that to inform what the risks are is really important. You will want to cast the net a bit wider. You may want to look at what some of your peers are reporting. As I said, there's a few good public databases out there. If you ask us, we also have our internal database of risks that we would use to inform that as well. So there's lots of different ways that you can kind of pull those risks together, but doing that in the context of the scenarios is really important. There's a couple more questions coming in, but we are at time. So as I said, if you have any further questions or there's any that we haven't got to, we'll follow up afterwards, or please do drop us an email and reach out. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Apologies again that it's me, not Ash, but I'll get her to do the next one so you can listen to her talk next time. Thanks, everyone.